Pride and Prejudice focuses greatly on the role of marriage in a woman's life in the 19th century. It explores the possibility of love in a marriage beyond security and inheritance. There are 5 very different daughters in the Bennet family, all of whom Mrs. Bennet is determined to marry off. Unlike the rest, Elizabeth Bennet will not settle for a gentleman without genuine respect and affection. As Jane Bennet falls for the new gentleman in town, Elizabeth forms a tumultuous relationship with his best friend. From an aristocratic and respectful background, Darcy treats others appallingly and Elizabeth does not stand for it. Over time, the two challenge and change each other constantly in their beliefs, thoughts, principles, and self-awareness. It begs the question of whether assumptions and appearances can be believed, whether the human character and mind can be altered, and if two people who are extreme opposites can ever be happy together. Mr. and Mrs. Bennet were trying for a son when they produced 5 girls consecutively. The sisters were all drastically different in character, with Jane being the prettiest, Elizabeth the smartest, Mary the plainest, Kitty the silliest, and Lydia the boldest. Mr. Bennet favored Elizabeth for her wit, whereas Mrs. Bennet favored Lydia for her fun-loving personality. Mrs. Bennet's next favorite child was Jane, simply because she was beautiful and had the best shot at marriage. It was almost the greatest excitement of Mrs. Bennet's life to learn that a gentleman was moving into a good estate nearby. It got pushed into second place only by the fact that he was single and had money. She urged her husband to visit Mr. Bingley so that he may perhaps choose to marry one of their daughters. Mrs. Bennet's only wish in life is to see all her daughters married off. For her sake, Mr. Bennet obliged. Upon his visit, he even acquired an invitation to a ball that Mr. Bingley would soon be hosting. Everyone who attended the ball agreed that Mr. Bingley was very favorable and handsome. He danced once with every girl who wanted to dance with him and twice with Jane. It became rather obvious to others that the two were drawn to each other, especially Mrs. Bennet. Jane and Mr. Bingley shared the same kind of sweet temperament and were perfectly suited for each other. In attendance at the ball was Mr. Bingley's best friend, Mr. Darcy. At first, people found him to be even better than Mr. Bingley. He was more handsome, richer, and had a better family background. In a societal manner of speaking, he was by far the most eligible man around. He lost in personality alone. Where Mr. Bingley was friendly and respectful, Mr. Darcy was proud and conceited. When Mr. Bingley suggested for his friend to dance with Elizabeth, Mr. Darcy had scorned the idea. He didn't want to dance with someone who wasn't all that beautiful and was seemingly unwanted. It was Mr. Darcy's misfortune that Elizabeth overheard this. Jane received and accepted an invitation from Miss Bingley to dine at their estate. As it rained on the journey over, she fell sick and had to stay there until she recovered. Worried, Elizabeth headed over to keep her company. She couldn't help but notice the bizarre mannerisms of Bingley's sisters. It differed from their brothers. However, it wasn't in Jane's nature to think badly of anybody. Jane's interest in Bingley matched his fondness of her. Yet nobody was making a move to further the relationship. Their similar nature was a curse in this respect, for neither wanted to risk ruining anything. Throughout the time Elizabeth spent there, Darcy found himself increasingly drawn to her. At first, he had thought her ordinary but now found her beautiful and intelligent. As Elizabeth's dislike of him grew, so did his affection for her. There were moments and conversations where it almost seemed the two quite enjoyed each other. If not for the fact that her family's status didn't match his, he realized he could actually like this woman. As Miss Bingley became aware of Darcy's interest, she started teasing him and bad-mouthing Elizabeth out of jealousy. Life had been wonderful for Jane until she received Miss Bingley's letter. Bingley had left town with no intention of returning. They had been so happy together that Jane couldn't figure out why he would leave without an explanation. Elizabeth saw right through it. She knew it was Miss Bingley and Darcy's evil plan to keep them apart. She knew they wanted Bingley to marry Darcy's affluent younger sister, Georgiana. She communicated this to Jane, but even in a state of despair, Jane maintained a positive stance on their character. As she was heartbroken, their relatives, Mr. and Mrs. Gardiner, thought of a plan to bring her on a trip out of town as well. Their estate was nearby the Bingleys' new residence. Despite spending quite some time there, Bingley never visited Jane. When Miss Bingley finally did, she seemed cold and distant. For all the good times and amiable feelings they had, it seemed Jane wasn't destined to marry Bingley after all. It hurt her more than she was letting on. As time went by, she resigned to accept her fate. One day, Bingley showed up at the Bennet estate randomly. Jane was still highly affected by his presence, and he was very much still in love with her. Yet Jane was convinced his behavior was simply spurred on by a good upbringing and not affection for her. After all the misunderstanding and wasted time, Bingley took the plunge this time around and proposed. This made Jane the happiest she had ever been in her entire life, and she accepted instantaneously. The announcement of their marriage also threw people off of the entire ordeal caused by Lydia and Wickham. Elizabeth knew with certainty this proposal was Darcy's doing as well. Darcy had righted all his wrongs and more. There wasn't a single thing wrong with him now, except that he was barely paying her any attention. She found herself eager for time with him, for conversations, and for a chance at what she was offered before that she had turned down. Elizabeth Bennet found that perhaps she did want to be the mistress of Pemberley after all. It was surprising that Elizabeth developed an interest in Mr. Wickham and that he seemed interested in her as well. Once they started conversing, Elizabeth was impressed with his speech, action, and character. It was through Wickham that Elizabeth got to learn more about Darcy's devious character. The late Mr. Darcy had wished to provide money and residence for Wickham. However, Darcy didn't fulfill this upon his father's demise. Wickham believed that Darcy was jealous of him and that he was generally standoffish to anyone who isn't of equal status to him. As Elizabeth already had negative feelings towards Darcy this whole time, she believed Wickham's stories and sayings. She was horrified to learn just how repugnant Darcy was. Though it may seem as though Darcy was the wicked one, it was Wickham that Elizabeth's aunt had warned her to be wary of. For Elizabeth, Wickham left a good impression and Darcy was built entirely on assumptions. Mr. and Mrs. Gardiner wanted to bring Elizabeth on a tour of Darcy's great estate. After being reassured he wouldn't be there, she agreed to it. At Pemberley, the housekeeper praised Darcy endlessly. Having known him since he was a child, she genuinely believed he was the best human being. She ventured that not a single servant in the estate would disagree with her. Furthermore, he had an admirable affection for his sister. It pained Elizabeth to learn that she wasn't as rational as she thought herself to be. The more she thought about how everyone, herself included, was prejudiced against Darcy, the more shame sunk in. To her horror, Darcy arrived unannounced. Elizabeth had no choice but to introduce him to her relatives. Elizabeth was ready for the worst from Darcy, yet he remained kind towards her. The Gardiners could read Darcy's affection for Elizabeth. He even wanted to introduce Elizabeth to Georgiana. Knowing how much his sister meant to him, Elizabeth was moved. Her feelings towards him shifted greatly from negative to positive. At Charlotte's invitation, Elizabeth went to stay at the Collins estate for some time. It was some time into Elizabeth's visit when Darcy showed up to visit as well. She also couldn't understand why Darcy watched her as closely as he did. Charlotte had deemed it as affection. Charlotte was proven right when Darcy confessed and proposed. Elizabeth's harsh rejection came as a surprise to him. Elizabeth couldn't marry a man who ruined both Wickham and Jane's chance at happiness. For the former, he refused to be faulted. For the latter, he was apologetic. He had misunderstood Jane's shyness as disinterest for Bingley and wanted to save his friend from heartache. However, his dislike for Wickham wasn't unfounded. In the past, Wickham had tried to trick his sister into marriage for money. This was after Darcy had already given him a large sum beforehand. After thinking it over, Elizabeth began to feel ashamed for how fast she had been to believe Wickham based on superficiality. As unfair as it was, it remained a fact that the Bennet sisters weren't allowed to inherit their father's estate. Mr. Bennet's demise would lead to his estate being passed down to their cousin, Mr. Collins. Upon his visit, Mr. Collins had marriage on his mind. It was Jane he first picked, followed by Elizabeth when he learned Jane was unavailable. He had expected gratitude and acceptance, but all he got was rejection. Elizabeth was not the type to marry without love and respect. Despite her mother's insistence on her acceptance, her father was proud of the choice she made. In the end, Mr. Collins would settle on Charlotte Lucas. Elizabeth was shocked to find that she knew so little about her best friend, as she never thought Charlotte would accept. Unlike other women, Charlotte didn't think much of marrying or falling in love. She simply wanted the safety of a place to live. In the end, Elizabeth was determined to accept her friend's choice even if it went against her ideas and wishes. Shortly after, Mr. Collins and Charlotte got married and moved away. All her life, Lydia has been flirty and reckless. Wherever the militia was, she was sure to be found nearby. Elizabeth had warned her father to keep a careful eye on and exert control over Lydia. He had dismissed it nonchalantly. Then came the day that Lydia eloped with Wickham. It brought such stress and despair to the entire household, even more so when they found out that Wickham had no intention of marrying Lydia. Mr. Gardiner was able to settle it by promising Wickham a great sum of money. Mr. Bennet couldn't believe his brother-in-law's kindness. However, Elizabeth learned through her aunt that it was Darcy who had resolved the entire issue. He was the one who had convinced Wickham, a man he disliked greatly, into marrying Lydia with his money. Darcy had done the Bennets a great kindness and didn't even want the credit for it. When she thanked him on behalf of her family, he had said she was the sole reason for his action. With every passing moment, she began to love Darcy more. It was a known fact that Darcy was set to marry Lady Catherine's daughter. Lady Catherine had somehow got wind of Darcy's previous proposal to Elizabeth. This prompted her to visit Elizabeth for a promise that she won't get in the way of the plan. Elizabeth flat out rejected her request, despite the threats. She couldn't make such a promise at the expense of her happiness. Shortly after, Darcy heard about his aunt's attempt and Elizabeth's response. Emboldened by this, he proposed to Elizabeth once more and she accepted. Everyone was surprised but trusted Elizabeth's judgment. Darcy and Elizabeth challenged each other in all the best ways. They grew in each other's presence. They were married and lived at Pemberley together. Elizabeth developed a friendship with Georgiana. Her father visited often. The couple maintained their friendship with Mr. and Mrs. Gardiner. Jane and Bingley moved into an estate nearby. In the end, Elizabeth dared say she experienced more joy and love with Darcy than even Jane did with Bingley.